Welcome back to Harbor. There was some tough questioning today for the State Department in the Senate and House hearings about the Benghazi attack. Two senior officials testified and acknowledged that the department needs to do better and make improvements to prevent something like this from happening again. This week, an independent investigation concluded there were, quote, systemic failures at the State Department in a run-up to the deadly attack. The report led to the resignation of 4 senior State Department officials, including the head of diplomatic security. Here was Senator Bob Corker this morning taking the department to task. Let's watch.
What I saw in the report is a department that has sclerosis, that doesn't think outside the box, that is not using the resources that it has in any kind of creative ways, is not prioritizing. I cannot imagine that we had people out there with a lack of security existing. It seems to me that what the State Department would have done is to prioritize, and if in fact we cannot have people safely there, not send them there.
Well, absent from today's hearing, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. She's expected to testify next month on the same questions. But today's focus was the failure of Clinton's State Department to recognize the deteriorating security environment in Benghazi. So what are the lessons from Benghazi and how high up should the focus go? Michael Hanlon's a senior foreign policy fellow at the Brookings Institution, and P.J. Crowley is a former Assistant Secretary of State for Public Affairs. Let's go, gentlemen, the same question to you as experts in this field. Is this the kind of thing that happens when we have nervy, courageous diplomats who are willing to go into dangerous areas, and it just happens that occasionally the enemy erupts up out of nowhere? You can't predict the next turbulent storm to hit in one of these areas of the Third World, especially in post-revolutionary Libya, and that it's not really anybody's fault unless everything that happens bad is somebody's fault. Your thoughts, Michael?
Chris, it's an important question. I have a nuanced answer. This was clearly not the State Department's finest hour, and it's easy to say in retrospect. But also, I make an analogy with military commanders in the field who often make decisions that could be second-guessed and sometimes wind up getting people killed unnecessarily. But you don't assess a battlefield commander's entire tenure based on one battle or one decision that went bad. You understand you're going to make some correct calls and some bad ones. That's how I interpret this. This was not the best decision that could have been made in regard to Benghazi. And we do need to accept a certain amount of tough criticism from Congress.
Well, whose decision was it? Was it Ambassador Stevens' decision to go into a very dangerous area where there wasn't a regular government, there wasn't a regular military or police force, the normal arrangement where the host country protects you? Well, there wasn't really a host government there to do that. They relied on militia who were very unpredictable and perhaps dangerous in this case.
Well, the larger point I agree with, Chris, that in this case we have to avoid a zero defect, zero casualty mentality. It will prevent us from having an effective foreign policy. And there are some innate dangers, and sometimes correct decisions will lead to people getting killed just because that's the way the world works. In this case, I do think that it's fair to ask if the State Department should have made some better decisions. But I don't see it as the sort of thing that amounts to a huge error. It's worth going back and asking how we can prevent it from happening in the future, but it was not a huge error.
Do we want, Mr. Crowley, do we want diplomats, career people who become ambassadors in tricky areas? Do we want them to be the kind of people that go to Benghazi to try to deal with the locals, with the militia, or do we want somebody who stays back in the protection and the environment of our embassy? Do we want, which kind of guy or woman do we want?
Well, you want Chris Stevens, and you want him exactly where he was. I mean, to Senator Corker's clip, ironically, this was the State Department thinking outside the box. Chris Stevens had been in Benghazi in the midst of the civil war, advising the rebel group that became eventually the interim government, and he was back in Benghazi for the first time, since he had been a special envoy there, as ambassador. I mean, obviously, and I think you touched on it, Chris, which is the miscalculation here was thinking that in a post-conflict environment like Libya, the same normal rules of the Vienna Convention apply, that the host nation can provide for security. So I think, much as the military learned, from experiences like, Beirut in 1983, Khobar Towers in 1996, that when you deploy people into dangerous situations, you've got to concentrate on force protection and bring the resources with you that can provide an adequate level of protection. The State Department's got to rethink how it operates in these kinds of environments.
Well, I still remember '83, and I think that was the wrong decision to put our troops there with no purpose but to guard the airport. It was a symbol of strength, not strength. Anyway, New York Congressman Gary Ackerman is retiring at the end of this term, and he had strong words for his fellow representatives, I think especially Republicans, at today's House hearing on this matter. Let's watch Gary Ackerman.
This might be my final 6 moments to speak in my 30-year career here. And I want to first start by apologizing to the deputy secretaries, because you have been brought here as a ruse. You are being used as foils to the conflicting intentions of some people on our committee and others in Washington for partisan political purposes.
Well, I've always liked Gary Ackerman. I went to Ethiopia with him with Mickey Leland years ago, and I like him even more now. P.J. Crowley, what do you think of that assessment? Are these hearings basically a witch hunt? What are they? What are these hearings about?
Well, they're about political politics, and we saw that with the episode, the preceding involving Susan Rice. But at the heart of this, the Congress, resources is not the only answer, but Congress bears some responsibility here. When a defense budget goes up to the Hill, congressmen trip over themselves thinking, what can I add to this budget? When a State Department budget goes to the Hill, they look at what can I subtract from it. The chairwoman of that very committee has been very outspoken about chopping significant sums of money out of foreign assistance. So ultimately, there are two agendas here, and to get the lessons learned and integrate those into State Department operations, there are going to have to be more resources devoted to this task.
But let me ask you both this question. How many troops can we put in a facility which is basically associated with a CIA operation in Benghazi? We can't plant a small military force there without causing all kinds of trouble, a show of force like we did in Lebanon, Beirut back in '83. You just invite the kind of attack we had back then. Let me go to Michael on this. Why would you want to put a big detachment or contingent of U.S. troops with all that firepower at a place like Benghazi and just station them there without expecting that to be a lightning rod for any local militia that wanted to make its bones?
Well, Chris, what I would say is you're right. You can't have it be huge. You could put a couple dozen people there, however, and I think there's a good chance they could have held off this attack. But your larger point I agree with. I agree with your larger point, which is that there are going to be some attacks that you can't repulse with a small force. And that's the kind of uncertainty you live with in a world where you've got to operate in dangerous places. So I think the larger point is State probably should have done some things differently here. Congress probably should have done some things differently here, as PJ says. Let's all learn from this together. Let's try to make sure we do better the next time, but let's not pretend we can get to a zero defect, zero risk foreign policy.
Quickly, PJ, do you know of any evidence that this is getting around the right wing and people contacting me like they all do, saying they called for help, they refused to bring help because they wanted to keep this low key, they didn't want to make terrorism look too big before the election? Is there any truth to that?
No, I don't think so. I mean, there are still questions that we don't know the answers to, who did this and why. But no, there was no cover-up here. There was a tragedy, and as Mike just said, we've got to learn the lessons and apply them smartly so that we can do better next time.
Okay, Merry Christmas, gentlemen. Thank you for coming on. Michael Hanlon and P.J. Crowley.